Welcome to After Empire. Today we are talking to you in the midst of tremendous systemic chaos and uncertainty. A couple days ago, Iran and Israel engaged in direct military confrontation regarding missiles being launched on both sides, and there's a severe escalation of a very long-term crisis in the region. And I think that when these types of things happen, there's a tendency to look at them just in the bubble of recent events, trying to read the tea leaves of who could win and who could, all of this, right? And I want to take a step back and take a more long-term view of what's happening. What does chaotic uncertainty actually mean, both for the system of capitalism, the capitalist world economy, but also any particular moment of conflict within that system. And I've been really trying to meditate on that for a while now, actually. And it's kind of hard to clearly articulate the ideas. So I turn to you to ask you, because you've heard me talk about this stuff for a while, how can we begin to make sense or make some sort of coherence out of all this volume of information around chaos and around uncertainty as fundamental principles?
I mean, I don't know, but I think that, this morning you and I were talking, and we were talking about the end of capitalism, which is something that I think a lot of people fantasize about for a lot of different reasons. And I think the conclusion that we've come to is that maybe that end is not quite so far off.
Or maybe it already happened.
Yeah. And so, right. Yeah. So you offered some provocations, right? That really the provocation that the assumption of the continuity of capitalism is like the key dividing line shaping people's political approach or perspective or analytical framework today. And so I think that's kind of part of what we want to unpack.
Yeah, I think wherever you are in terms of the opinions or your orientation to capitalism, anti-capitalist, pro-capitalist, whatever, the fundamental question is, do you assume its continuity in perpetuity or not? And that has opened up some major ruptures. I think, like, we've been reading some examples. I'll go through the list of just a couple of books that we've just read over the past, less than a year, maybe. I haven't read this one by Jody Dean yet, but Capital's Grave. You've checked this out, right?
Yeah, I read it. Capital's Grave. Neo-feudalism and the New Class Struggle, which makes a case that capital is dead and something called neo-feudalism is emerging, right, which I think taps into a lot of other discussions people are having, like Varoufakis on techno-feudalism, right, where he makes a similar argument that, capitalism's gone, something new is emerging, and he calls it techno-feudalism. There's like over a dozen books that are making these arguments. There's Mackenzie Wark, who had a book published in 2019 that says, that's titled, "Is Capital Dead? Is This Something Worse?" And so there's been people studying the economy, politics, culture, political philosophy who have been meditating on this, I would say, for decades plus, kind of reading the tea leaves, as you just kind of put it, to say, like, it seems like something else is going on right now. How can we capture that in words so that we can talk about it and also, like, maybe play a determining role in what that looks like? Yeah,
so I think to take a step back to, like, really dig in on what do we mean by the dividing line being this assumption about continuity, right? Mm-hmm. There's a lot that we can go into about specific factions that assume this, right? But I want to kind of step back and think through the implications of this statement and its meaning. So let's start with neoliberalism.
Oh gosh, sure.
Right, exactly. You said, oh okay. Gosh, right? Because I think that it's played out to a degree to really fixate on it.
The concept or the reality?
The concept is played, like, people use it as this shorthand, as if it's this unprecedented scenario that financialization within capitalism is a new thing that happened post 70, like post 1970 or so, and that it's this new stage of capitalism, and that actually may not be the case. That one of the things in this book Chaos and Governance in the Modern World System by Arrighi and Silver, which is an edited collection. But there was something interesting that popped up in it that I think helped reshape what we're trying to get at around the assumption of the continuity. Because if you see the patterns, which financialization happens in hegemonic transitions within capitalism, that's one of the arguments of this book. So it happened in the transition from the British to the US as the hegemon. It happened in the transition from the Dutch to the British as the hegemonic power of capitalism. So you had financial speculation, and you had a shift from productive capital investment to pure finance. And there were reasons for that, and it's kind of technical, but it has historically been a signal of transition. And the question now is and I bring up the neoliberalism to say, was that a transitional kind of financialization of the economy that's going to transition to another hegemon? And many people are guessing like that would be China or whatever. Mm-hmm. Or is it something that is a signal of a terminal decline in the system of capitalism itself more broadly? Because every single hegemonic transition was accompanied by an expansion of the territorial basis of capitalism, mm-hmm. to eventually the entire globe, but also an expansion of the social compact, or the personnel that were contained as the junior partners upholding that system. That expanded more and more. And that now, for there to be a hegemon, it would have to include, one, the entire globe. It would have to create systemic solutions for the entire globe, and for not only settlers, or like in the past, settler population versus slaves versus, other oppressed nationalities. It has to deliver for a broader constituency to uphold this new phase of a capitalist world economy. And what they're arguing in this text is that that's not on the cards. Mm-hmm. And so do other people, like Immanuel Wallerstein has a number of arguments around the structural limits of capitalism. We don't have to get into a whole bunch of the detail there, but it includes things like the material limits physically of the world to absorb pollution, for example. Yeah. It includes like the demands from the population, not just in the advanced economies around universal healthcare, education, whatever, but minor demands among the masses of the actual globe in the so-called third world or whatever for the basic dignity, the same kind of basic dignities, and that this system can't accommodate them. So you've seen massive destruction of people's societies. That's what we see in the Mideast, for example, is the liquidation of their state apparatuses in order to create populations that can't make those kinds of democratic demands on the system, mm-hmm. and are then therefore populations that have to go and supplement the mass consumption in the core by being either undocumented laborers or skilled immigrants, mm-hmm. coming in and allowing the standard of living to be inflated. So like these dynamics are highly disruptive at this moment, and they're happening when there's not a prospect for some sort of transition to, say, China or whatever. Right. And that's the core argument, right? So either I say all of that, those technical things, I think you put it to me like, okay, so then if we're not assuming that there's going to be a new transition and there's going to be stability, what does it mean to what are the implications for how we go about
I think to put it in really simple terms, if, say, you're assuming that the continuity of capitalism, then you might, for instance, right, as many people do, see your radical or revolutionary horizon as being anti-capitalist. What is the point of being anti-capitalist if capitalism is already ending, right? Just having a different structural analysis of where we are within the range of this, like, iteration of a world structure or world economy is going to change your political horizon and how you articulate something as simple as a slogan, mm-hmm. let alone like more complex analytical maneuvers like what you were just offering.
Yeah. And then also on the flip side, this question of anti-capitalism has a lot of shades of meaning, right? like a communist state, say China, for example, they have the block of 4 classes, or had during the revolutionary period, that included their national capitalists. Why was that the case? And that had to do with the way that the world system was constructed, the orientation of European capital to the economic system of Asia that China had been the center of. And they're trying to figure out how to do development and how to, and what broke down for me in reading this was, okay, you have a communist system that contains capitalism. What does that tell me about the nature of socialism and its relationship to the capitalist world economy? And it ruptured something for me, because I was like, oh, this stuff isn't coming from Mars.
Right.
It's coming from the historical processes of capitalism itself, and the expansion of the capitalist world economy. And that's what's informing the creation of socialism, and they're within that process and system. And that, yes, it's a different governance structure that can lead to different, not just
outcomes.
treatment in the near term, but
different
systemic
production
outcomes.
processes.
All that
You're
it's consequential. But it brought to me the idea that that process has historically ended, and yet capitalism is not more secure than when China became capitalist and communism was erased from basically the governance of the world. It didn't.
I mean, I think
safer.
though, to pause there though, I mean, I think a lot of people would argue that capitalism is more secure precisely because there's so many iterations of violence that you can point to as that people often use as evidence to argue that capitalism is extremely secure, because there's things like slavery basically happening, and so how do you make sense of that?
Well, I think that,
like, how do you point to something like a production process and say that's capitalism or not capitalism, and why, and then why does it matter?
So I think that gets into a much bigger question. Fundamentally, I think capitalism is defined by the endless accumulation of capital as an end to itself.
Right.
And it's not about markets. It's not about, it's that. And then it's an interstate system and a set of historical conditions and assumptions that facilitate that process of endless capital accumulation as an end to itself.
Wait, okay. So I'm going to interrupt you. So we just watched Mountainhead.
Yeah.
Which is, who's the creator?
Jesse Armstrong.
Yeah. So
Succession guy.
Yeah, it's a movie. It's kind of like watching a play. Four tech billionaires, or I guess one's only a millionaire.
Yeah.
for 3 tech billionaires and one millionaire who becomes a billionaire by the end of it, maybe. Anyway, are up in a cabin in outside of Park City, Utah, and they're pulling strings. They're talking about what they want the world to look like and what role they play in that process. And so, yeah, how's that different from the endless?
And it's basically playing out this book.
Sure. But how is that different from being oriented towards the endless accumulation of capital?
I think one of the things that's interesting about that film is, despite the surface dialogue of the characters and the presumption that they can control the world, it's clear that they cannot.
Right.
And then, and that
although they can do a lot of damage along the way.
Exactly. That their efforts to pursue this are out of step with the historical conditions that are and dynamics being unleashed by their very activity.
Yeah.
So the movie has a situation where they're creating AI tools that can generate very real videos, right? And they're looking at the consequences of this stuff that's undermining their ability to do the capital accumulation in and of itself, which is calling them into saying things like, maybe we need to coup the United States. Right. And what can the state apparatus even do independent of our enablement? And it's this, and that question in the context of the film is the capital holders asking or questioning the foundational assumptions of the capitalist world economy, which has an interstate system, national sovereignty, the Treaty of Westphalia, these kinds of things. They're openly rejecting in the film.
Or undermining or ignoring or circumventing.
Yeah.
Yep,
And
totally
so
maneuvering
the system
around.
is unmoored
Yep.
from its axioms.
I mean, what's interesting though, yes, right? They are circumventing all of those things. Like, obviously, they do not care about national sovereignty, even a little bit, which is true in the world today. But at the same time, they're still engaging the state apparatus, both the United States and other state apparatuses, as a tool through which to try to, like, move their chess pieces, basically. And so that tension is really interesting to me.
Yeah, it's that. I think what I'm saying is it's not that capital accumulation can't happen. It's about the stability and reproduction of a capitalist
And I
world
think
economy.
that all this is a little bit different than the accumulation of capital, but like something that does seem to me to be quite different about the world we live in today is that productive activity is not always oriented towards creating value. Or a product
or
of
goods
any, or
for
goods,
mass consumption.
You know, it's oriented towards like scamming and creating ebooks for people to buy, you know, like just stupid shit.
Yeah.
And there's massive amounts of money that are circulating on the back of
Advertising.
Yeah.
Which again, this grows out of, and that's in this text. I highly recommend this book to people. In that book, they make the argument that with U.S. hegemony, here's what it promised: two things. One was basically a domestic New Deal and a global New Deal, both of which were anchored by assumptions of mass consumption. And basically, they needed to stimulate this mass consumption, one among their junior partners, which would be like the so-called middle class in our society, but also the national elites in places around the world that would maintain extractive and exploitative regimes in other parts of the world, right? And so they had to invent all these techniques to like advertising, for example, planned obsolescence, all of these things to generate continuous mass consumption of their productive of their mass production, which itself came out of the war machines that they had created, which again, historically within capitalism, there have been massive 30 years wars. What we call World War I and World War II is like one war that produce hegemonies that are able to create stable constituencies and structural bargains to maintain capital accumulation. Previously, in the transition from the Dutch to the British, there was a 7 years war, or what we call, in my high school textbook, was called the French and Indian War.
Yeah.
But this was a war between France and Britain, and the process of doing the war created the productive capacity and skill to transition capitalism from the Dutch model to the British Empire. And like, that's what these big wars did. Now, the U.S. has the most powerful military apparatus in the world. That's true. But when's the last time they won a serious war?
Yeah, it's been a while.
And they lost to Vietnam, and that created an economic catastrophe that ushered in what we, in the beginning, we're calling neoliberalism.
Right.
Just because you have the bombs, the guns, all of this, they still can't determine a stabilizing outcome systemically, or even for their own internal to their own country. So then that's why Mountainhead could even make this argument, imagined argument by these super rich elites, because the system's not, everybody knows the emperor has no clothes. Well, not everybody.
Not everybody.
but the people from all the classes, I'll say, know that. And that's why the dividing line is it just an aberration? Like, these guys are idiots.
Right.
We need to step in, or whatever, like in Mountainhead.
Right.
Or is it the terminal decline of the system? Are we not assuming the continuity of capitalism? And if that's the case, what does that require of us?
So if we're not assuming the continuity of capitalism, then what role is there for people to play in that process? Because I think to some degree, like, sometimes these grand systemic arguments can feel really like disempowering, for lack of a better word. Like, oh, the world's just happening around me and I'm merely a pawn in this grand chessboard, as what's his name?
Brzezinski.
Puts it. So like, if this transition is happening regardless, then what role do the masses of people have?
Yeah, I think for me, this is what it's all about. Two things. One, I guess it's a three-part argument. Number one, we've established, I don't think that we can assume the continuity, that there's a terminal decline. There are lots of reasons for that. Number two, in this context, the big powers can't actually stabilize or dictate the outcomes. It's just chaos. And there's degradation both on an interpersonal level. Yeah. There's degradation as far as living standards. There's degradation of we live in just degrading times, just period. And that brings me to the third part, which is, okay, if we don't assume the continuity, then there's a race between what ideological positions and governance practices or structures or apparatuses can emerge to provide stability and reproducibility. And that the terms upon which that's going to happen are either going to be more egalitarian than what we've had, more inclusive, more sustainable, these types of principles. It's not some utopia, but it's like moving in that direction towards sustainability, inclusion, solidarity, these types of things. Or it's going to be less.
Yeah, more fascistic.
Yeah, more something beyond fashion, some new thing. But I think we're in the transition to a new world system that's not capitalism. Maybe it'll have elements of that, maybe.
I mean,
I
it
don't
probably
know.
will, right? Like, there's always elements of the old and the new, right? In the same way you were talking about, like, capitalism being fundamentally a constitutive element of what, like, socialism and communism were imagined to be. Mm-hmm. Like,
yes. I think that there's going to be a new system, though. Mm-hmm. And that one of the hard parts, especially for communists, is that there was so much certainty in the communist vision that, okay, capitalism's doomed and we're going to organize to end it. Yeah. That's been a lot of the ideas. Right. We have to, unite the workers to engage in the process of ending capitalism. And that requires the conscious, organized, concerted activity of communist ideologues to guide that process. And I think one of the hard parts is that process of the unraveling of capitalism has continued without the organized command of communist ideologues. That this is a thing that's happening. And so both they're like the vision is correct, there's an uncertainty that has to be embraced. And that doesn't say, okay, we seize state power and then change the world. Right. And that's that. There's actually something else that's happening that we have to adapt to. And I think it's not just communists thinking about that. There's all kinds of people thinking about that. Yeah. That's why that whole techno-feudal thing and the Mountainhead movie, which that's on HBO, by the way. I highly recommend watching it. It's basically like a play.
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, it's fine. Not even like that great.
It's not like it's not that good, but it's like very useful. It's a useful touchstone. But it's fun. But I think really like bleak way. Yeah, they're really like thinking about. Yeah. They're questioning everything. And I think
what's so hard though, right? Part of what you're saying is that something new is coming. What exactly it is undetermined. And I think what I've been struggling with in recent weeks, as we've seen like the escalation of chaos, to shorthand it, and also thinking about things like Mountainhead and reading books like Techno-Feudalism, is I keep like the question that has started to come up for me is I'm like, is it undetermined though? Like it seems kind of bad.
Oh yeah.
So I'm like, how undetermined is this transition actually? And so not to be, super cynical or defeatist or anything, but yeah, I don't know.
I think it is because they can't come up with solutions. They can cause damage.
That's actually, I appreciate
that.
And
they have a
good thing to highlight.
They have a revanchist point of view. They're out here trying to talk about Western civilization. Yeah. Get out of here, bro. This is not 1857.
Yeah, it's
like,
not.
Please stop. So
Very
they're not,
persuasive.
they're not able to work from
To compel the masses of people
to
in a certain
create
way.
a social compact that it can actually stabilize the whatever the hell they want to do. That hasn't been, they haven't figured that out yet, and I don't think they're on the way to doing that.
Yeah.
This
I don't think that's
Iran
gonna be done,
Israel
like,
thing.
tomorrow.
This Iran Israel thing is just an further example
Right.
of like, even if they defeat Iran, it does not matter. Like they
Right. What does that even mean in this context? To like we were talking about this earlier, to win a war. Like, it's not like
To
the end
create
of World War
waste.
II.
That's it.
Right. Where it did have a stabilizing effect on the globe, where new transnational institutions like the IMF, the UN, the WTO.
That was way
no, that
later,
was later.
but-
Wait,
yeah,
I was
but
like,
it's
wait,
still-
but what's
it's
the one
still-
that I'm
it's the same
missing? The
thing.
IMF.
World Bank.
The World Bank, yeah, right, were all created in the aftermath, and they did have this sort of global stabilizing effect where there was a security regime locked into place, also in part through the Cold War,
Yeah.
right? And like, of course, there was violence and horrible, degrading shit happening all the time, but like, I don't think that's going to be the outcome that we see from someone, whoever, winning one of these wars.
Yeah, not on the scene. And I think like the challenge, I think, was that in the past there was more territory to absorb, and therefore you could like states.
Is that why Trump's going for Greenland?
Yes, actually.
Yeah, right.
Like literally, yes. But like the difference is the expansions into these areas had a stabilizing effect on the system because you're incorporating them into your value chain and productive processes.
Right. And we can look at the whole process of decolonization across Africa and Asia. And,
Yes.
you know, what happened in the aftermath of those
and there were
processes where new people and industries were incorporated into capitalism.
That's right. And destroyed.
Yeah.
So the
Yeah,
indigenous
yeah, right.
manufacturing
Yeah,
industries were
absolutely.
destroyed in these processes. So you had two waves of decolonization out of the hegemonic transitions.
Mm-hmm.
The transition to the British Empire involves the decolonization of the Americas, for example.
Yeah.
And that's settler decolonization. That was their approach. So you had the creation of the settler republics. In the US transition, you have an appeal to national, like, self-determination as a core principle, and the expansion of state apparatuses to the colonies. And people have argued this is neocolonialism, all kinds of stuff. But the
Right.
fact remains that structurally happened. There was a structural decolonization of a kind, just like there was settler decolonization, and it was for the purposes of consolidating imperialism.
Right.
And like, where is that happening now?
Yeah.
It's just the production of waste in
Right.
these wars. Like in World War II, the biggest antagonists are Germany and Japan. Look at them now.
Mm-hmm.
There was a reconstruction process in order to stabilize the capitalist world economy for this new constituency that they had
Right.
created under U.S. hegemony. Really, this Israel-Iran war is leading to something akin to that? I don't think so. So it's this twofold embrace of the chaos and uncertainty, and then trying to figure out what does that require of us programmatically, ideologically, and interpersonally.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it's really hard to figure out.
Yeah,
You
it is
can't
really
do it
hard.
on your
That's
own.
what I was going to say. So if someone were to take the provocation seriously and wanted to start investigating this, like, what would you recommend? Where would you start? What would you do?
Yeah, so I think right now there are two ways you can go about it. One of the ways is trying to understand the governance systems of the past. Reading about China, reading about Soviet Union, reading about the
That's what I was
empires,
going to say.
all of
Also
these
reading
things.
about like Reconstruction, I
Yeah.
always find really instructive. Reading
All of
about
this
really
stuff.
any like society that's gone through a major
rupture and transitions, right? These, and trying to figure out like what was that like, to try to understand the nature of the capitalist world economy. The other part is kind of trying to reverse engineer who I consider to be the enemy. So there are, when you were saying what are they on, and I was like, they have this revanchist idea, like when you mentioned the Greenland thing. Reverse engineering what they're trying to do. They're trying to promote Western civilization. So
Yeah.
investigate what that is, and
As a construct,
as a
yeah.
construct, and how that fit into the capitalist world economy. racism and sexism, how these things actually worked as historical practices within this historical context, right? So to do that, I got them sitting over there in this tower of books, but I needed to understand the historical construction of Europe. So I used two main texts to like really dig in. There are 4 books called The Modern World System, by Emanuel Wallerstein, and they're essentially a history of Europe and Europe as it expanded across the world in the process of creating the capitalist world economy. So you get to recontextualize things like the Reformation in Europe. Mm-hmm. What was that actually about? Like, really, that's about people's opinions about indulgences in the Catholic Church? Like, yeah, but like not really. Yeah. Like, there's a class struggle happening around the expansion and consolidation of the capitalist world economy within Europe. That's what's happening. And it's a 30 years war.
Right.
So I read that, but I also needed to understand Christianity. So I read a really big book.
I would also say, though, like, you are very much so someone who will be like, you can't understand this if you don't understand these things. And as an educator, I have a different approach. I think there's a lot of different starting points. I think, like, I've taken a different approach to learning about this stuff, and but you still kind of end up in the same place. With these ghouls. Are you joking? Whatever. That's an argument for a different day.
I revel in doing battle with the ghouls, and I need to understand how they think so that we
have different roles. I have to educate whoever shows up in my classroom. So I have correct. My own position to play.
I like listening to them to understand how they're trying to stabilize the system.
Yeah,
which is
whatever.
Through racism. And an appeal to Christian authority, like in this context, in this culture.
Yes.
And so I need to understand, well, what are the Christianities? Because they have a certain understanding of what this is. It's racist. It's all this stuff. And that's...
Yeah, I think that's all true. The point I'm trying to get at is that I don't think you have to be too prescriptive with this kind of stuff. I think there's, like I said, a lot of different starting points because there's been a lot of ruptures in different contexts around the globe over many, many centuries.
Many questions.
And so starting with any of those will start to give you insight into how transitions happen, for instance. What limitations do you see occurring repeatedly, throughout history?
And what is the capitalist world economy? Like, I think it's indispensable. I do believe in a degree of prescription. It doesn't matter what you look at if you don't have an assumption that there is a capitalist world economy as absolutely. The unit of analysis for understanding the nature of capitalism. Because if you don't have that, that's what I'm saying. Like, you look at the Protestant Reformation in Europe. Mm-hmm. If you understand the capitalist world economy, you understand that conflict differently.
Yep.
Like it's just very important, and it helps to...
But my point is that, sure, yes, you need to understand the capitalist world economy and all of its, in various details about that. But I think for somebody who's also maybe like, I understand capitalism generally, and I have strong feelings about it, and I have a political conviction, you can also read those texts with a political conviction and come to the same conclusion that you're talking about, even if you don't understand every single nuance of the capitalist world economy and how it's specifically structured and what industries play the biggest role in it. You can.
I don't know. So when you're asking why does this matter, right? Yeah. What are its implications? I think that because there's chaos and degradation and uncertainty, that means that the production of governance, governing power, is really paramount. Mm-hmm. And we have to develop practices that facilitate governing power, mm-hmm. and give us the capacity to problem solve in ways that are ideologically transformative, and towards this more egalitarian, more sustainable, all these types of things. Like, it's one thing to say that, but like, actually, how does one do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like part of what we're interested in exploring here, not even like in this video specifically, but through After Empire is like, what are the different institutional or otherwise like mechanisms through which to engage those questions? Yeah,
and I think that we've got to touch on all the questions. There's a thing from What Is to Be Done that Lenin has. I think I'll end it here. But he says that the objective of the communist struggle is to answer all the questions affecting all the classes in the society. Mm-hmm. And that's that's exactly what we're in right now, is like, it's a race to answer these questions affecting all the classes.
Yeah.
And then be able to operationalize that programmatically. And you can't do that if you don't have a method of inquiry and investigation to like understand social questions in context.
Yep.
And the reactionaries have a context that they are articulating as being the answer. And I think like reverse engineering that helps us in some ways to be able to combat it.
Sure.
But like, it's not just about combating what they say. We have to have a positive program and that's why we titled this project After Empire, for life after empire, not simply being in an antagonism with the existing opponent, but actually, even if they didn't exist, we'd still have problems of like figuring out how to structure a society.
Right.
You could take over every city in the country right now today, and you'd have some real problems being able to run a program without any let's say that there's no military, no assassinations, none of that. You are going to have problems. And I think figuring out methods of governance and thinking these kinds of things through is the most important thing that we can be doing right now.
Cool.
That's it.
Till another day.